Have you ever met someone who seemed incredibly talented? They were naturally smart, athletic, charismatic. Maybe they had every advantage that you could imagine. Yet somehow, years later, they just never became what everyone thought that they would. Then you've also probably met somebody else who seemed pretty ordinary. Nothing flashy, no special advantages, no incredible talent. But year after year, they just kept showing up. They kept learning, they kept improvising and improving, and eventually they passed everybody else. Well, why does that happen? Well, today, on a brand new episode of the Pursuit of Progress podcast, I want to talk about one of my favorite lessons from the legendary Zig Ziglar. He said, your attitude, not your aptitude, determines your altitude. It's a simple sentence, takes a couple times to get the words correct, but I do think it might explain more about success than almost anything else that I've heard. So really excited to share this brand new episode, again, on the Pursuit of Progress podcast. Okay, guys, so let's just jump right into it. First and foremost, just want to thank you guys for being back with me this week. I want to start off by explaining what the word aptitude is. So again, the theme of this episode is a Zig Ziglar quote, one of my favorite kind of original OGs when it comes to, self-improvement gurus, Tony Robbins, all these different people that have came since Zig Ziglar. He was one of the first guys that really, entered into this space. And my grandpa used to, listen to him back in the day, and we're talking probably 40 years ago. And I even have a set of cassette tapes that he gave me, probably about 2 decades ago that would be fun to pull out and listen to sometime. Just have to find a tape deck. But anyways, just again, this quote of his that I think is really, really valuable and just really inspiring. Your attitude, not your aptitude, determines your altitude. Kind of screwed it up, so I'm going to say it one more time, guys. Your attitude, not your aptitude, determines your altitude. So again, what is aptitude? I had to just look it up just to give you guys a little bit more clear description of what aptitude is. And basically, it's just simply meaning that your natural ability to do something. Some people, they have an aptitude for math. Others maybe have an aptitude for music. Some people can walk into a room and instantly connect with everyone. Other people seem to naturally understand business, or maybe it's athletics. Think of aptitude as the gifts that you're born with. It's kind of like your starting point. And then the things that you seem to come easier to you than that maybe they do to other people. Now, those aren't, those are gifts, and they absolutely do matter. But here's what Zig Ziglar says, and I think it's really important. Your natural ability only gets you so far. Your attitude determines how far you'll actually go. And, again, just thinking about my personal life, you guys, with my grandpa, he had always a glass half full, one of the eternal optimists of anybody that I've ever met in my entire life. And he just really reminded me how important attitude is, I think almost more than anything else. If I had to have a superpower, and I definitely don't, and I wish I was a lot better with my attitude, but I think one of my superpowers I would love to have would just be having a positive, great attitude all the time. It's just crazy how people that have that, how much different they look at the world. And it just seems like they always are able to get over hurdles, just overcome obstacles so much easier with a positive, optimistic attitude. And why attitude wins, in my opinion, is basically this, you guys. Attitude is how you choose to respond. So do you complain? Maybe you look for solutions. Do you blame? Or maybe do you take ownership? Do you give up? Or do you try that one more time? That's attitude. And unlike aptitude, it's something that every one of us gets to choose. I've seen incredibly talented people quit just because something got hard. And I've also seen some pretty average people accomplish extraordinary things simply because they refused to stop. So talent might get you noticed, but attitude really determines whether you stay in the game long enough to succeed. Now, response matters more than circumstances when we talk about this. I think something that's really important to understand that I always have to remind myself is, life isn't fair. Some people start with more opportunities, more money, maybe more support, better education. And other people, they face challenges that most people never even see or can even imagine. And we don't always get to choose our circumstances, but we do get to choose how we respond to those. And that's where attitude lives. Two people can experience the exact same setback, One might say, why does this always happen to me? Kind of that victim mindset. And the other could be saying, wow, what can I learn from this? What can this teach me? Same exact situation, but completely different future. And because of this, the response shapes really what happens next. I think that is so powerful. Now, just a personal example of this, just bringing it into the real estate sphere, since a lot of you guys that are listening or connected with me is through real estate. When I started in real estate, I didn't have decades of experience. I wasn't the biggest name in the industry. There were, tons of agents who knew way more than I did, but I could control something else, and that was that I could learn. I could show up consistently. I could answer my phone. I could treat people well. I could listen. I could keep getting a little bit better every single day. The same thing has been true with my YouTube channel. Nobody starts with just thousands of subscribers. You upload videos that pretty much nobody watches. And, sometimes you wonder if anybody's even paying attention. But if your attitude is, I'm committed to this, I'm improving just one video at a time, eventually those little small improvements, they're going to begin to compound. And the same is true in business, fitness, relationships, pretty much everything in life that is worthwhile can be applied to what we're talking about here. And it also has to come down to just people that are refusing to quit, no matter what. And, you can take this to an extreme and, in some cases it might not be exactly accurate, but pretty much if you want something bad enough and you don't quit, you can accomplish it. And I gave that little caveat because, me, I'm 5'9". I'm not going to be a NBA basketball player. So there are aspects of this that you have to kind of be realistic about. But I'd say though, the 99% of things out there that people have goals with and are inspired to try and accomplish, this definitely is very true. And it just comes down to being, willing to do what others aren't and just to keep going. History is full of people who succeeded because they just simply refused to quit. A couple examples, Thomas Edison, he reportedly, I think, tested like thousands of different materials before creating the practical light bulb. Look at how much that's changed the world. Walt Disney, he was told that he lacked imagination. I don't think he even really got successful with Walt Disney until he was like in his late 50s or 60s. Michael Jordan, he was always famously, the story about him was, how he was cut from his high school varsity basketball team before becoming, obviously probably the greatest player of all time. And, were all these people talented? Absolutely, of course. But talent alone wasn't the reason they succeeded, in my opinion. It was their attitude. And because of that, they kept moving forward when most people would have stopped. Success often belongs to the person who's willing to stay in the game longer than everybody else. So, with all that being said, how do we improve our attitude? Well, the good news is that attitude isn't something that you're born with. It's something you build. So here are a few simple habits that have helped me personally. And I know Ben, he's off this week, obviously, but I think he would agree with these. And first, it's just protecting what you consume. Pay attention to the voices that you're allowing into your life. Maybe the books that you're reading, maybe the podcasts you're listening to, just the people that you're surrounding yourself with. What kind of news are you allowing into your brain? Everything that you consume influences the way you think. I'm definitely going to be a little example of this for you guys. With all the politics that were going on, especially on election years, you get to the point where it's just like, man, why am I even watching and listening to this? It just kind of feeds all this kind of negativity into your brain. And before you know it, your attitude is affected. So it's just really important to be conscious and very intentional about what you let in and what you don't. Another example too is just how you can practice gratitude and how important that can be. It's hard to be grateful and bitter at the same time. So if you just start every morning by identifying 3 things that you're thankful for. I know it sounds simple, a little bit kind of basic, but that's because it is. It's simple. And sometimes what is simple is also more effective than something that's too complicated. And then after you've done that, the third thing is just stop comparing yourself to everybody else. And this is one that is so hard right now, especially if you guys are on social media and you're just, always seeing the highlight reel of everybody else. Stop comparing yourself to who you were yesterday. That's the only comparison that really matters. You need to think about yourself as just somebody that is getting better day after day. And as long as you can see that progress being made, don't worry about everything else. It's all just noise. And then the next one is about setbacks. So you got to expect that setbacks are going to happen. Problems, they don't mean that you're failing. What they mean is that you're doing something worthwhile, because every meaningful goal is going to come with obstacles. You can't be surprised by them. You have to be prepared. And then finally, guys, last but not least, just remembering that progress beats perfection. And that's why Ben and I have this podcast called The Pursuit of Progress, because progress is the most important part. You don't have to be the smartest. You don't have to be the most talented. You don't have to even, really be an expert in your field, but you do just have to keep moving forward one step at a time, one decision at a time, and I think more than anything, one improvement at a time. So, with all of that being said, you guys, I think what Zig Ziglar's message is really saying here and why it's lasted for decades is because it's timeless. Talent is valuable without a doubt. Don't get me wrong. Education matters, experience matters, but attitude, that's the engine that keeps everything moving forward. And if you're willing to learn, if you're willing to stay humble, if you're willing to adapt and keep showing up and refuse to let any temporary setbacks define you, you'll often outperform people with even far more natural ability. So today, just ask yourself this one simple question. Am I spending more time wishing I had more talent, or am I making the most of the talent that I already have? Because your future probably won't be determined by the gifts that you were born with. It'll be determined by what you choose to do with them. You guys, thanks so much for spending time with me today on a brand new episode of the Pursuit of Progress podcast. Ben and I will both be back next week. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode. And I'd be grateful if you guys hit that like and the subscribe, share that with a friend, and leave us a review if you guys can on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. And more than anything else, you guys just share with a friend, and hopefully we'll see you guys on the next episode next week on the Pursuit of Progress podcast. We'll see you then. Keep pursuing progress. Bye.